Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. So, in today's episode, I am going to be talking about the father wound. I'll be talking about what the father wound actually means, visible signs of how the father wound can show up in relationship dynamics. Now, with social media, there's a lot of terminology that's thrown around, and it can be linked to certain elements of like attachment dynamics, relationship dynamics, etc. And some of it's helpful and some of it's not. Some of it can be very illuminating. It can help people feel seen, validated and understood in terms of like their lived experience and what they went through. And a lot of this does go back to adverse childhood experiences. A lot of it does go back to your experiences trying to gain attunement and your attachment needs met in childhood. So, specifically speaking, in this episode, I'll be talking about the father wound. And what that means is it refers to the psychological impact of having an absent or an emotionally unavailable or potentially abusive father figure as a child and growing up in that system. Now, it can also describe where there's absenteeism with a father figure in the family. Now, that could be, as I mentioned, emotionally, physically, but it can also relate to having a very dismissive, demeaning, critical, negative, even abusive caregiver as a father. And that can have a major impact on your sense of self, your self worth. As I mentioned there about attunement, meeting your developmental needs. And on an unconscious level, that's imprinted, and it's one of those things that then becomes a template within the unconscious part of the mind. Now, the brain seeks that which is familiar, not that which is going to make us happy. So, very often these patterns can replay in your adult relationships, and it's important to recognize that. So, again, father wound refers to an emotional or psychological impact of an absent or distant father, a father who could have been physically or emotionally unavailable, and I also mentioned they're abusive or neglectful. Now, that affects a person on so many levels, from their identity to their confidence to their self worth and to their ability to connect, be vulnerable, and meet their needs through relationships. Relationships can be very, very problematic as a result of this and their background. And at its core, really, when we're talking about father wounds, we're talking about a type of attachment trauma. And that is going to have so many effects on the person. As I mentioned there about their sense of self, their identity, their self esteem, but also their coping behavior. Now, I could talk about coping behavior with self esteem till the cows come home. Your ability to communicate, your ability to navigate conflict, your ability to speak up to get your needs met, your ability to use your voice, the ability to be fully authentic and true to yourself is all connected to your sense of self, your self-esteem, that inner sense of self-worth, the ability to express yourself authentically. And a lot of that is connected to safety, both internally and externally, and also how we learned to navigate and survive the family of origin growing up. Now, if you had that kind of father figure or that kind of dynamic at play in the family of origin, that can be quite challenging, and that can influence not only your behavior but also your experience and expectation of the masculine and of male templates. So it can be quite challenging in that sense, but it's also worth recognizing, like, within that dynamic, especially with men, and I'm going to do an episode on potential male wounding and men's work in the next episode, but a lot of this is passed generationally from generation to generation. So, the father potentially grew up in a system where elements of this behavior was present. It was passed forward down the line, and it's often passed in that way from father to child. So the wounds of the father, the unhealed trauma, what's not transformed is transferred. And unfortunately, this would go through the child, and that behavior, that aspect of how that person showed up within that family of origin would be imprinted then on the child. That would be their experience. So they would have inherited elements of that unhealed trauma. So one of the things that we need to recognize with the father wound is it has major impacts on attachment, as I mentioned, and also that unconscious element of relationship dynamics, because we're not seeking out partners that are going to hurt us. We're not seeking out partners that are going to confirm our fear that we're going to be abandoned, that we're not lovable, that we're unworthy or not good enough. Like, nobody wants to put themselves through unnecessary pain. They just don't. However, on an unconscious level, what I mentioned there about the subconscious, it will seek out that which is familiar. It's what we would call repetition compulsion. So it's driving elements of traits that were familiar to us on an unconscious level that can pull us in. But within the father wound, it affects every level of how we would experience a relationship, from our ability to attach, the level of depth of intimacy that's there, our ability to trust, our ability to communicate. And on a personal level, your ability to even regulate your nervous system, to be able to work through your emotions, to be able to get grounded, to create that inner safety, can all be connected back to the impact that fatherhood in early childhood experience. Now, when they talk about it from the perspective of somebody growing up, we're talking about what's known as a noxious childhood experience or an adverse childhood experience. And that is the thing, because, we're talking about a form of trauma that's happened from a caregiver. So there's going to be an attachment injury within that as well. And that is going to create its own sense of problems going forward. Now, that might not become apparent until, you're much older and you're starting to try and experience fulfillment through relationships, and then you might start to see where these behaviors are showing up. This can often come up in therapy when we explore, what relational dynamics was present within the family of origin. But look, this can also lead to complex trauma, especially where there's prolonged neglect, where there's abusive behavior, emotionally abusive behavior, where there might have been trauma witnessed within the family of origin. And, where there's complex trauma, there's going to be a whole assault on the nervous system. There's going to be a whole assault on the sense of self, the ability to feel safe, the ability to be regulated, the ability to connect within relationships. There's going to be fear of connection, fear of intimacy, fear of abandonment, all those different things happening. And depending on the age as well that the person was, we're also talking about developmental trauma potentially as well, which can impact you physically, mentally, emotionally. Your cognitive and social development would also be affected by that. And that can create challenges in and of itself. Your ability to relate to people in a social setting, to form bonds, your ability to get out of your comfort zone, to be able to show the real self. And even to be present, say, even within the education system, with all that going on in the family of origin, can be very, very challenging. And look, that's before you even start looking at the impact on physiology. And we're talking at the nervous system, or we're talking about the brain, or we're talking about how that can actually impact the person very early on in terms of their coping, their behavior. And look, it's a very, very intense dynamic to have to process. And I think anybody that has grew up with any kind of attachment injury, whether it's from a mother or a father, it creates its own unique challenges. And it's part of this is about understanding it as well, because it's not that you deserve this. It's not that you're responsible for this happening, but it's about recognizing where these behaviors are showing up in your life, how they're showing up in your relationships, where it's holding you back, and also not judging yourself for how you have learned to cope as a result of being in that system. Now, I am going to talk about ways in which this can be helped, and healing can begin to take place. I'm going to give some suggestions on the way that I think would be helpful to go about that. But if we're talking about some of the ways that the father wound can present itself within adult relationships, and specifically with coping behavior, what we could be looking at, and it's not always causal, but it can be linked to it. We could be talking about somebody here who really struggles with boundary setting, maybe finds being assertive really challenging, struggles to say no. So people pleasing would not be that uncommon where there's the father wound. And that because the person's struggling with their self-esteem, maybe with the need for validation, they can also be prone to some codependent style relationships. So that's not that uncommon in those circumstances. But when I was talking about that repetition compulsion, or that unconscious repetition compulsion, I should say, the person is unconsciously seeking out relationships with also emotionally unavailable partners in their adult intimate relationships. So again, we're not basing this on things like looks. It would be primarily traits, patterns, and characteristics of potentially the father figure within the family of origin. Now, that also happens with a mother wound as well, but when we're talking about it in this context, we'll stick to the father. So again, once you start looking at your relational history, you start exploring the types of partners you've had, you start exploring the types of behaviors that's present over those course of relationships, you will start to see a pattern emerge. And also within that, you'll see a pattern of your own communication, your coping behavior, what worked, what didn't work, how you regulated yourself, how you weren't able to regulate yourself. There might have been safety issues, vulnerability issues, there could have been attachment behavior going on, but that will all become apparent when you start reflecting on previous relationship experiences, just from a place of curiosity, not from a place of judgment. Very often people that have experienced attachment injury or the father wound in childhood will struggle with their self-esteem. They'll struggle with that inner belief, that core feeling of not feeling good enough, constantly striving to achieve, the need to achieve, to prove your sense of worth. And underlying that is a need to gain approval and acceptance. That might be from the father figure, it might be for the self, but it's that deep-rooted feeling of not feeling good enough. And again, when we were talking about low self esteem, that is a whole load of different ways that becomes manifest. So, like with communication, how the person goes about communicating can be reflective of their level of self esteem, their inability to be assertive, to set boundaries, to use their voice, to ask for what they actually want, to get their needs met, to be able to navigate through conflict in a very healthy and grounded way, to be able to enforce boundaries, communicate boundaries. And look, those deeper rooted feelings of not being enough or not being worthy or not being lovable, that all has to be unpacked, challenged, changed, and processed on a deeper rooted level. And again, growing up in that system with the brain, if we think of the brain kind of like a prediction machine as well, it's constantly looking at where have I seen this before. So this happened, then this. So the brain's looking at, I don't want this outcome to happen again. So it's anticipating certain things happening. And that's part of the problem, is that you've become so accustomed to a certain way of being that is what the brain's primed to see, and unfortunately it pulls us back into those scenarios. And even within the belief systems that's at play, beliefs drive behavior. Elements of your expectations, your conditioning is all centered in the experiences of the family of origin, whether it's implied or it's explicitly stated or it's learned through adapting your behavior to the environment that you're in. But all that needs to be unpacked, explored, and looking at how this is currently showing up in your adult relationships, how this is holding you back, and also challenging the certainty of those beliefs, the certainty of those behaviors and expectations, and actually recognizing what's working, what's not working, and what can be let go of. Right, I need to take a breath because that was a bit of a big one. So again, this person may feel or may have been emotionally neglected or actually physically abandoned within childhood. And when we're talking about the follower one, we're talking about not having a secure, safe male attachment figure. So somebody that was attuned to meeting your needs. And it's very likely that you had the opposite in some way, shape, or form. So maybe not present, maybe very critical, emotionally absent, distanced, maybe demeaning, feeling like you could never measure up or gain their sense of approval. There could have been active condemnation even within that. And that can create that deep-rooted mistrust. That can create that fear of abandonment. At the core of this is connection. You just wanted that connection, that affection, that presence, that attunement from a male figure, and that wasn't there. Now, when we're talking about that chronic low self-esteem, we're talking about that lack of self-worth and that need to achieve. It can also feed into perfectionism that's masking a feeling of inadequacy that's underneath that. And perfectionism and unhealed follower wounds, they can be there, but that person is trying to compensate for, as I mentioned there, that underlying fear of inadequacy, trying to seek that validation, seek that approval, trying to prove it to themselves and unconsciously prove it to others. Now, when we're talking about the feelings connected to the follower wound, like we're talking about a massive level of unprocessed anger, we're talking about rage, deep mistrust, we're talking about huge levels of resentment, and it mightn't have been safe to even communicate these things, but these feelings need to be processed, they need to be integrated, because it will impact your other adult relationships, and this can come out through outbursts. It can become displaced. You might find that certain things are triggering it in the present. You might not be aware of what it's connected to, but that's a big part of it, because those feelings are still in the nervous system, those feelings are still in the body, and it's like any complex or trigger that's there until somebody pokes it and you don't know it's there, and then you have that reaction. Then it has to be addressed, because then you've caught an element of the pattern. You have to take personal responsibility for it. You're not responsible for how you were treated as a child, but as an adult, the impetus for your healing and your responsibility is on you, unfortunately. And again, within that approval seeking behavior, this is the problem when it comes to your adult relationships. There could be a very unhealthy dynamic of seeking validation and approval of men, and this may even come at the cost or detriment of the self. It can lead to people pleasing. It can lead to you editing yourself, toning yourself down, molding yourself into something that you're not. And again, in order to get validation, connection, affection, attention from a male figure, and you may find that some of them relationship dynamics that you've experienced have been exploitative, or they weren't really safe containers for you to be you. You had to be something that you weren't, or you had learned that is the only way that you would gain acceptance. Now, within that, there's also, for some people, they're so disconnected from their own internal experience, their own emotional landscape, I suppose, is the language I'm trying to say. And that can show up as hyper independence, hyper vigilance, constantly looking at threats, threats to their well-being, threats to the relationship, the fear of being abandoned, hurt, exploited, rejected. And that can make it very difficult to relax. It can make it very difficult to connect and to be vulnerable. So vulnerability would be mega challenging for most people that are potentially identifying as having suffered the follower wound. And at the core of this, we're talking about trust. Struggling to trust the self. Well, you can't trust the self. That's that hyper independence, because you're the only person that won't give up on the self. but struggling to trust others, and that can massively affect connection. It can massively affect the emotional depth of the relationship. And there is that inability to be with the body, to be in the body, to be in that emotional experience. They might find it very overwhelming, very uncomfortable. They might struggle to actually put language to what it is that they're experiencing. Vulnerability can become very, very difficult, but that can also create distance within the relationship because they will not feel safe. They'll keep people at arm's length. There will be that mistrust, and that can affect connection, and it can actually feel like for a partner that they're being pushed out or pushed away over time. And look, this is one of the things that can come up within therapy. Then, when we look at the behavior, when we look at the barriers to connection, that can start to become evident. Now, like again, if you had a very demeaning, very critical parent within that as well, that can also become rooted then in how the person sees themselves. So that can manifest is having a hyper negative inner critic, being very self critical in your self talk, putting yourself down, being very harsh and judgmental towards the self. That can also extend the body image. Being harsh and critical about your body, that can also, I suppose, in some ways affect your behavior, your eating habits, all those different things. But again, we're still talking about elements of the nervous system not feeling safe in the body, and we're talking about nervous system dysregulation. So I spoke a wee bit there before about how this can lead people in their adult relationships and the codependent dynamics, because it's again, you're choosing somebody that you feel needs you. It's that need to be needed, that need to be wanted, and there might be that dependence. And the thing is, that becomes consistent because there was a lack of attention, presence, affection, connection in childhood, and this has now been repeated in a different dynamic now with somebody where it is a very one-sided thing. Like, you're having to play a role to meet that connection. It's like that belief that that person won't be able to cope without you. Like, that you're needed, but it's a poison chalice. You're stuck in a container that you don't actually benefit from being in, but it's the only thing that actually gives you a sense of self-worth is that person needing, wanting you. And it's a very, very tricky and difficult space to navigate because it's so hard for the person in a codependent dynamic to get their needs met. So spoke about that nervous system dysregulation, and how that can also show up is through the behavior, how that person has tried to learn how to cope, and numb the feelings that they're going through. And that's probably the best way to put it, is numbing. So trying to shut down their emotional experience through numbing. I would call this irrelevance when I'm working on the systemic family therapy approach. So that could be trying to dissociate from the pain, the unhealed trauma that's coming up in the nervous system. They could do this through work, their career, through food, sex, gambling, addiction, through substance abuse. There's many ways that this can actually take form, but it's not being able to be with the emotions that surfacing within the body. Now, there's other ways that can kind of manifest. Like, I suppose we could talk about self-sabotage, and this can actually show up as well, an attachment behavior. So some people might actually find themselves sabotaging their relationships, out of fear of rejection or fear of abandonment. They might end up picking fights, they might end up cheating, they might end up withdrawing, shutting their partner out, thereby creating the outcome so that they're in control of it and they're not on the receiving end of it. And that can be a very unconscious process, and it can also cause a lot of pain and a lot of frustration because, in part, they do want a relationship, they do want that connection, but this coping behavior is historical, and it's about that nervous system regulation. It's about getting the person grounded, feeling safe, empowered, and resourced to be able to have these conversations and navigate that terrain with a partner. Now, when we talk about it from an attachment perspective as well, that can also show up with the avoidant behavior, and it can also show up with the anxious attachment. So that constant reassurance, some people would call it neediness, that idea of being clingy, controlling, constantly seeking validation, constantly seeking reassurance and approval. But underneath that is a real crippling fear of abandonment. And, that they can have that dependence on the partner, but that can also become quite smothering for a partner as well. But again, it can be connected to the dynamics in childhood. Now, within that, and I did say there about the neediness and the reassurance seeking, but different strategies will come up with different people. So some people might become very controlling, they might become very demanding, they mightn't give their partner space, they mightn't give their partner privacy, they might demand to be everywhere, they might want to know every single thing that person's doing, they might be trying to test them to gauge their loyalty, to gauge their level of love and commitment so that they can feel safe and secure. But for the partner on the receiving end of that, that can become very tiring and very overwhelming. And again, on the avoidance side of things, when we're talking about that emotional disconnection, it can be very hard for that person to connect on a level of depth because, again, vulnerability hadn't been safe for them. They don't know how to be with the emotions. They don't know how to be in the body. They mightn't have the language to be able to communicate how they're feeling. And if they're disconnected from the self, it's going to be quite challenging for them to be able to communicate what they need within the actual relationship. So again, when we're talking about the follower, we are talking in part about attachment injury. Now that can, as I said, show up as avoidance. It can show up as anxious attachment, and more extreme cases where there's abuse and neglect. We could be talking about the disorganized attachment styles as well. We're talking about adults who have endured that system and had the impact on the sense of self, the self-esteem. It affects the communication, their ability to regulate the nervous system to keep themselves grounded. And, that is going to show up then in their ability to communicate with their partner about what's coming up for them in a way that's very grounded and consistent, rather than having extremes and emotional outbursts or having no response at all. And a large part of that will come down to how regulated the nervous system is. And as I mentioned, like even with confidence, self-esteem, self-worth, how are you going to be able to have a sense of self, a sense of self-worth, to be able to set boundaries, to get your needs met, to communicate, to do all those different things to get your needs met, if at the core of this you've got other stuff that's going on beneath the hood, such as dysregulated nervous system, the meaning making, the conditioning, your beliefs and expectations, all those things that are disempowering you from actually getting what you want. And the coping behavior, again, if you grew up with dysfunctional behavior within the family of origin, and that's all that you ever seen, and that's all that you've ever known, and that was your norm, you're going to repeat it unless you've consciously decided that it's not working for you. And it's not to say that you'll do this all the time, but you'll do it under stress. You'll default back to what you've seen or how you survived that family system. And this is the thing that makes therapy so fucking transformational. When you're able to understand your entire journey, when you're able to look at your communication, your coping, what you were exposed to, how you learned to survive and adapt, how that showed up in your adult relationships, you create a level of self-awareness around what has to change. And I'm not saying it's an overnight thing, and I'm not saying it's easy, but with that awareness as an adult, you can recognize that some of these behaviors have no place in your adult dynamics, and that you can choose differently. You can choose to pause, you can choose to get grounded, you can choose to get regulated, you can come back to these conversations, have them in an empowered, calm way. You can try different strategies, you can do nervous system regulation, you can unpack some of your beliefs, expectations, rules, and actually assess them. Does these fit my current way of being in my life and my sense of self? And can I let this go? And again, it's not to say that it's a get out of jail free card for your parents, like hurt people, and about pain being passed down the line. But again, when you look at the system as a whole and you look at your generational maps and you look at the families that your parents came out of and then your grandparents' family, and you see the wounding that took place, you see the behaviors that they were exposed to, you see historically and contextually what was happening, you can have an appreciation for how that affected them, for how they then parented, especially if it was unconscious. If they did all that they ever seen, they can't give you what they didn't have. And I'm not saying that that's a cop-out, but if they're drawn from their own experience of their own childhood and yet it had a devastating effect on you, you can imagine what that might have been like for them. If you go back a generation before, you can think about what your grandparents might have been like as parents, what that family system might have been like contextually, what might have been going on at the time in terms of stressors. Historically, there could have been war, there could have been recession, there could have been different things going on. And again, this isn't about condoning lack of attunement or abandonment or any of those things, but we're looking at the lineage, and we're also trying to process how this came to be and the impact that had on the self, how you then navigated that system and the template that you inherited. Because again, until you make elements of the unconscious conscious, it's going to keep driving your behavior. It's going to keep driving you to repeat the pattern of what you've been drawn to. And I think, look, when I'm working, even with any degree of trauma, I work at clearing the emotion, I work at clearing the impact, I also work with the body. So I think that's very, very important, is first to validate the emotional experience that you've been through, to look at the neglect that was there, to look at the impact of the childhood, to work through any big traumatic memories that may have been in place, clear that from the nervous system, work through it even in terms of the conscious and unconscious mind, so that trauma is integrated, those feelings are validated and processed, and that the person is able to own their story, they're able to talk about it from their experience without judgment, and that's very, very validating in and of itself. Then looking at all the inherited behaviors that were at play, like how the parents communicated, how they engaged in conflict, how they resolved conflict, intimacy, discipline, family secrets, illness, all those different things being explored, unpacked, processed, and looking at what you've carried forward whether consciously or unconsciously, into your adult relationships, and then looking at what needs to change, looking at what the barrier has been. Do you maybe being more assertive to be able to set boundaries? Looking at your old relationships, the type of people that you were with, what the barriers were. Do you get your needs met? You know, was this largely your part because you were people pleasing, because you didn't speak up, because you didn't ask for what you want? Or was it a safety thing? Was it nervous system dysregulation? Was it a lack of confidence, a lack of self esteem? All of those things systemically have to be looked at, improved, integrated. The person has to become resourced to be able to make those changes. And I think within the relationship dynamics and looking at the old relationships, we can see consistently, you know, what worked, what didn't work, what needed to change, why you were drawn to those kinds of dynamics. And I think when you think of the most highest empowered version of the self, it's very unlikely that that version of you will go back into them containers with a good solid sense of self. You know, and this is part of the problem with your first experience of relationships. You know, you have no blueprint, you've no idea what a relationship's supposed to be like. You go cartwheeling into the world looking for love and connection, and like your first couple of relationships could be an absolute car crash. There could be major trauma caused, there could be major attachment issues caused. It could massively affect your confidence, self-esteem. You know, it could put you off dating for a long time. There's loads of different ways that that can affect you, but within that, there's also the space to reflect on how you showed up, how they showed up, what way you coped, why you coped that way, what was similar, what was different. To be able to look at that and understand it, and to be able to transform it then going forward. And it's not to say that, I think like within relationships, one of the things that is encouraging is, although wounding can happen in relationships, when we work on ourselves, when we unpack our stuff, when we process and integrate it, healing can also take place in relationships with the right people. And I've definitely found that in my own life. I find that with clients, that relationships can be very, very healing. They can be very fulfilling in that regard when it's with the right person. But all that comes from you being resourced. All that comes from you taking the time to work through your own stuff, to heal, to explore your story, explore your origins, work through the trauma, work with the nervous system, work through the conditioning, look at all the things that didn't work in the past so that we're not unconsciously repeating patterns going forward. Because look, we can change the face, we can change the type of person, you know, to an extent that we're kind of attracted to. But those traits, those dynamics, if we keep doing what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got. And that is a form of fucking madness. So this is where the coaching, this is where the therapy, this is where becoming a resource and knowledgeable can begin to help. And then I would also argue the nervous system safety, the regulation of that allows us to feel grounded, safe, secure, and confident enough to lean into these changes going forward. Now, look, some people might believe that you need to forgive in order to move forward. It doesn't always sit right with me. You know, you might want to acknowledge the anger, hurt, and pain that was caused by your childhood. You may or may not want to forgive, whether that's from a religious place, spiritual place, or whatever. I think there's a level of acceptance that can be a wee bit more helpful as opposed to forgiveness, because I feel with forgiveness, I have to give them something. Whereas with acceptance, I can acknowledge that it was how it was, you know, for better or for worse, and that shaped my journey, and it's difficult, and I can work with the feelings that came around that. But I don't feel like I need to put that responsibility for my own healing on my ability to forgive something that I maybe might never be ready to forgive. And I don't necessarily feel that clients need to do that either in all contexts. And look, people might disagree with me, and that's okay, you know, but I think that's where some people can get really stuck, is that idea that they have to forgive in order to move forward. But I do think acceptance and integrating acceptance can be every bit as powerful without the need to move to forgiveness. So it's just a thought. And like, look, it is a challenging process going through, you know, your childhood, your experiences growing up, your adult relationships, you know, and you do need to be patient and compassionate with yourself. And look, you're going to have judgments that are going to surface around things that happened and things that didn't happen that should have happened in terms of your developmental needs, in terms of having a present, attuned parent. And that's all part of the journey as well. And I think like when we're talking about people that are trying to get specific interventions and healing, working specifically with a father wound, there are certain things that you can explore. Now, there's loads of different therapeutic approaches out there. I'm just going to run with, pardon me, some things that I think would be quite good. So, attachment focused therapy. Actually looking at your attachment style, unpacking it, looking at how it showed up in the family of origin, looking at how them patterns are there, understanding the ins and outs of the attachment style that you have, and again, moving towards a more secure attachment style. Now, within that, I still am a massive advocate for somatic work. I think with all the attachment styles, somatic work is important anyway, because you need a regulated nervous system to be able to stay grounded, to be able to respond as opposed to reacting. And I hope that makes sense, especially in the face of being triggered or certain things happening. It's our ability to self soothe and regulate and get grounded that helps us stay in the conscious present moment, and that helps us make informed decisions. So, yep, attachment focused therapy. EMDR can be very good for working with trauma. Now, there's a load of different trauma based approaches you could look at. You could be looking at like somatic psychotherapy, you could look at sensory motor psychotherapy, you've got the work of Stephen Porges looking at polyvagal theory, you've got Deb Dana, you've got Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, but they're all, centered around body work as well. There's loads of rapid forms of change work that can be quite helpful. I could rhyme off a load of different ones, but to be perfectly honest, they might not be for everybody. They'll be for some people, and I also feel that it'll come down to the skill of the practitioner. I've had people that have done EMDR have phenomenal experiences, and for some people it didn't work. And that is run of the mill for a lot of different types of therapy. But again, working with the impact of trauma is an absolute must, especially when it's connected to developmental trauma, complex trauma, or that attachment injury as we were talking about. Inner child work, I think, is huge as well. Connecting to the inner child, integrating the emotion that's there, resourcing the inner child in order to facilitate healing can be very, very powerful. It can also be very, very emotional work when you're actually doing it or you're in it yourself. And part of that process is also going through learning to parent or reparent yourself, identifying where your needs weren't met, working through the emotional wounds that took place, that was connected in this case to the father wound. And again, the same themes keep coming up: meeting yourself with compassion, meeting yourself with a degree of empathy, love, support, and learning how to self regulate, learning how to self soothe, learning how to work with the nervous system. And that is ultimately what we're talking about with somatic based interventions, trying to create a sense of internal safety, being aware of the inner space, to be able to come back into the body, to have capacity to be with the feelings that's there. Because look, it mightn't have been safe for you to feel what you needed to feel when you were growing up. It might have been a chaotic environment. You might not have been allowed to own your emotional experience. And as an adult, that needs to change because you need to be connected to the body. You need to be aware of your emotional landscape. You need to be able to know where you're holding tension, what you're feeling, the depth of what you're feeling, the impact that that's having on the body. And look, I think I've said it before, there's four times as many afferent fibers going from the body to the brain than there is from the brain to the body. So there's a lot of biofeedback that comes from the body to the brain. And especially when we're working with trauma, the amount of stuff that can surface working somatically is huge. But I think it's massive when we're talking about connection and relationship safety as well. And it is a slightly different approach. It's a slightly longer term approach working with the body, but I do think it pays dividends when we're talking about attachment injury, father wounds, and things like that. Other things that can help would be like mindfulness, meditation, breath work can be transformative again because we're working in part with the body. We're working with the diaphragm. Diaphragm is very intimately connected to the psoas, which is like the seat of the soul. It's also one of the parts of the body massively affected by trauma. So you work with one, you're also working with the other, and that can help bring up big emotions. It can bring up a sense of self-awareness, internal landscape, and all those things. Now, look, I hope I didn't ramble on too much about that. It's just something that I'm seeing more and more of online. And I just wanted to add a wee bit of nuance to that conversation, a wee bit of input in terms of what it is, how it shows up. And look, none of these are completely diagnostic as well, because look, really what we're talking about is a lack of attunement, a lack of safety, attachment injury. Look, there's loads of different ways that these things can affect your relationships. But the most important thing is if this is resonant with you, if this is hitting home in terms of your lived experience, or you're starting to see this in your adult relationships with the type of people that you're being drawn to, or if it's particularly men that you're going after, get in touch, reach out. I'm more than happy to work with you. I'm not going to say I love working with trauma. I'm very effective working with trauma. I'm very effective working with relationships. This is something that I understand on a massive level. I've seen huge change with clients unpacking this, working through it, and then going on to have fulfilling relationships. It doesn't have to keep replaying. So if this resonates with you, please get in touch. If you think of anybody that could benefit from listening to this, please share it with them. And if you're following the podcast and this has been helpful and you're up for it, please give me a wee like or a wee review. It just helps get it out there to more people so that I can have a greater degree of impact. Because you actually genuinely don't know what's going to click for somebody where they might go, fuck, that's me. I've been there. This is what's happening. And look, they don't have to get in touch with me as long as it's a catalyst or a vehicle for that person. going and reaching out to somebody and creating the change that they need, that has a ripple effect throughout their entire family, their entire friend group, their support network. So anyway, I hope that helps. And I just want to say thanks very much again for listening. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any opinions, anything like that, please reach out to me on social media. Please engage with me. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation around some of these things. And if you have any suggestions for any further episodes as well, just shoot me a DM, message in the social media, and I'll see you again in the next one.